I had never been in one of these so-called mega-tall skyscrapers. Not so high up, anyway. These buildings had been the provenance of the Middle East and Asia for so long. There are still very few of them in Manhattan, as you know. But I was summoned to one of them. 1 kilometer up, 180 floors into the neo-futurist building. So high that I could actually see the Atlantic Ocean when looking across the landscape. It is unnerving being so high up when you are not in an airplane. An airplane has mechanisms to land. If there is too much turbulence in a building, nothing can help it land. There is only falling, no landing. No, I'm not usually afraid of heights, but I did want to finish authenticating this vessel as quickly as possible. Walking into this home, I was caught off guard by how the paintings and photographs on the walls changed as I entered the foyer. And I was even more surprised to see what they changed to. Works by Ana Mendieta, Cindy Sherman, and of course, Celia. I looked closer, though, and realized that they were not photographs. They were digital screens so clear that the paint on one of Celia's films appeared to chip right off. I turned to my escort, the young woman who must have worked for whoever this man was who owned this home. And I said, this gentleman must be very interested in the Foundation's work. And her smile, it grew into this void of teeth and tongue, her eyes alighting on me. She said, "Isn't this wonderful?" And she pointed to all the screens. And she said, "On the elevator rides up, a scanner photographed you and figured out who you are, who your associates are, what your public interests are. The computer uses all of this information to create a decor that you will find aesthetically pleasing. Mr. Vasiliev wants to make guests feel as welcomed as possible." And then she told me that it must be a little glitchy today, because the decor is usually set before we'd even step off of the last elevator. The funny thing about this was that I wasn't even angry about this stranger possessing all of this personal information about me. I was actually mad that even with all of this data, the machine did not display any of my own work. I considered for a moment that perhaps the computer believed me to be a modest man, and I would not want to see my own work displayed as I entered the home. I might be somewhat modest, but I still enjoy flattery. I wanted to see my work on this exorbitantly wealthy man's walls, to believe he cared about my work, even if in reality it was all just a mechanical farce. Perhaps the computers just did not believe that my work paralleled the Mendietas, the Merodes. And maybe it just believed that I had better taste than my own work. I settled on this explanation because, no, I did not ever become famous. You flatter, but no, I've never been famous. There are occasions when the Foundation will show my work in conjunction with Celia's and our contemporaries from eons ago, giving the students and other visitors a view of the world in 2015. That was the recent anniversary show, 30 years since the first Leftover Fun. The film, the original jar, the jar that still sits prominently displayed in the galleries of the Foundation. But At 83, these are essentially the only times that my work is trotted out anymore. To give context to Celia's life, when we continued into the home, some of the works of art changed, while others remained as they were. I assume the latter were authentic originals, though I could not bother to often glance at the walls of this home because on the other side of these monumental rooms were the windows overlooking New York Harbor, and then farther past that, Coney Island, the ocean. I was in such awe of the landscape that I did not realize that we then stood in front of the suspect leftover fund. The woman told me that this was it. I still just looked outside, gaping down at the clouds passing by, and then farther afield, where it was not a cloudy day. She said, "Mr. Rojas, can you help us judge whether this is an authentic leftover fund that you worked on?" I turned to the massive clay jar, taller than me, and I realized very quickly that I had no idea. Questions of authenticity regularly arise. How do you tell if an artwork is authentic when it was sculpted by an enormous robotic spider? They are the same issues that other artists faced after they allowed their sculptures to be cast again and again posthumously. Many of Rodin's thinkers, for instance, were cast decades after he died. He gave a number of molds to the French government, and France was allowed to cast editions of each sometime in the future. Dali made similar arrangements. When work is continually made after death, it can be difficult to judge if you are viewing a piece that the artist truly considered authentic. Posthumous editions by Rodin and Dali, however, were all pieces that the artists had molded while still alive. Celia, on the other hand, she never saw a single one of these editions outside of some digital schematics and her codes. They were all new. They would always be new. She would always be alive. The foundation displays dozens of volumes of books that hold the codes in their pages. She had asked for them to be bound like a collection of encyclopedias. The volumes are displayed behind glass on a long bookshelf circling the studio with the spider, but only one is ever opened. One is always open to the page with the most recent code. But these codes are only of use for the software that Susan created. If you put one of these codes into a typical 3D printer, you'd end up with garbage. And people did. I had never actually been brought in to authenticate a piece because whenever some novice tried using that one displayed code, they'd just end up with something that looked like a pile of anemic octopus scat. But I had been asked to authenticate this piece because it appeared to be true. The owner, however, for reasons that could only be considered dubious, did not own the certificate of authenticity. The vessel looked exactly like all of the other mason jars. Celia did not bother to have Susan write codes for the jars that gave them a hand-sculpted appearance. There were no hidden flaws for me to detect our craftsmanship. On the exterior, anyway. I really hoped that we would not need to bring in an X-ray machine. I walked around the vessel, trying to decide if my hands had once touched this piece, if I had rolled it out from underneath the spider and into the kiln. I was not willing to mention X-rays. Susan and I haven't decided how the vessel should be authenticated after I die, or after she dies. They'll probably need to use an X-ray machine, but even then, Only Susan and I could say for certain if they were truly Celia's. And even then, I don't know. I don't think Susan does either. So it was on this visit to this absurdly high home that I made a decision. After I stopped bothering to look at this vessel any longer, I said, "I am sorry, miss, but without a proper paper trail of the piece's provenance, we cannot prove its authenticity." The woman appeared disappointed, but it obviously wasn't the worst news she had ever received. Her boss had probably only paid $70 million for the piece on the black market. As she walked me to the door, past the images I was very familiar with, she said, "Mr. Rojas, I should say that Mr. Vasiliev only displays images of works that he owns. None of the pieces morphed into your own work because Mr. Vasiliev does not have any in his collection. He was not familiar with you until we looked into authenticating the vessel. So he has asked me to buy some of your works. He does not think his Merode collection can be complete without them." While we rocketed back down to earth in the elevator, I said, "I'll see if I can dig something up."